For now, though, Ben Clatworthy's here, travel correspondent with the Times. Very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
There was more trouble for EasyJet flights yesterday. Apparently, there could be a sort of summer of discontent looming.
Well, yes, the problem that EasyJet and all airlines are facing is huge disruption in Europe with air traffic control. It's a factor of things, one being staff shortages. Many of these well-paid air traffic controllers decided during the pandemic that they would take early retirement. Recruiting is taking longer. It's a stressful job. It needs a lot of training. It's not easy to get people in to do it and ready. That's taking longer. There's also 20% less air capacity in Europe because of the war in Ukraine, and there's the threat of strikes. There's been more strikes in France this year in air traffic control than any other year. That's them walking out in solidarity with the people affected by Macron's pensions reforms, even though they're not
strike
affected.
every summer anyway, don't they?
They do. There's Italian strikes coming up towards the end of this week off the top of my head, and there's also a threat of the central body Eurocontrol going on strike as well. So a trifecta of problems, as it were, facing
And so,
airlines.
I mean, does this mean if you are booked on an EasyJet flight, they will have to find you an alternative method of getting wherever you're supposed to be going?
Yes, so over the weekend, EasyJet cancelled 1,700 flights. Of those flights, 95% of people are already sorted and rebooked. However, one person I was speaking to today said it's a nightmare in terms of the timings that they've been given. Their flights were only over to Ireland. They're suddenly been completely changed what time they're going to depart. And the point was that they booked the flights they had for a reason. It's a multiple frequency route. When they booked the flights, there was lots of options to choose. They picked the flight times that they wanted for specific reasons to be there in time for an event, a wedding, and now that's not going to be possible, so they're looking at alternate routes. So there are a lot of people affected by this. EasyJet, though, their argument is that they're preemptively cancelling these flights to take some strain out of the system. They say they're flying 1,800 flights a day at the moment, so it represents a tiny proportion of the overall flying schedule. For the 180,000 people affected, though, they will probably have a slightly different view on what a tiny proportion of the schedule is.
And is there a limit time-wise on how soon they have to tell you if a flight's being affected, or can it just literally happen on the day?
Well, you get compensation if it's less than 2 weeks in advance. So what they've done is taken out flights in July, August and September. Now, of course, there will be some people listening who are affected by that 2-week window. Whether you get compensation also depends on how quickly they can get you to your destination. Do you exactly?
And they can't charge you more money or anything like that?
They can't, no. They have to rebook you free of charge.
Right, OK. Meanwhile, back home in Blighty, rail fares could be halved, it says here, under plans to let more firms compete on the same lines. Is this following on from the blockbuster news that all ticket offices are going to be shut?
This is a report by Rail Partners, which are one of the industry bodies of the railway. There are many industry bodies on the railway.
There do seem to be rather a lot of them.
This one is...
Do any of them do anything good?
Well, the Rail Partners, they're big on private sector involvement in the railway industry. Now, I didn't actually report on this. They put out a report. I didn't report on their report because I think you need to take it with a massive pinch of salt that rail fares are ever going to halve in this country. Their idea being more operators, more competition, fares go down. We've seen it in the airline industry before, the legacy carriers, when they got the competitions from the low-cost rivals. Has it been seen a little bit on the route up to Scotland with the arrival of Lumo, a low-cost train company? A little bit, but the legacy fares are still very high. Lumo charge less, so yes, there is an argument for
and
it.
Is that so two companies operating on the same actual railway?
Yes, so there's LNER and Lumo being the budget version, both operating up to Scotland. Lumo are cheaper. It's more no frills in some way. Not that going on the railways is
not many frills on the old
these days.
East Coast main line.
I have to say, though, I struggle to see any way that this is going to happen. Our railway capacity is already extremely constrained. I don't think there's any way, and I don't think anyone should hold their breath that fares are going to halve anytime soon. But it's a nice idea from effectively a railway think tank.
Yes. I mean, interestingly enough, I suppose, we do struggle to get the trains that are supposed to run at the moment on a line which is dedicated to only them running them. That seems to be difficult for us to do. So the idea of actually having more than one company operating on the same stretch of railway seems very far-fetched to me.
Well, there's that, and also the fact that often, and I'm not excusing the railway company's individual incompetence at times, but often problems are caused by things beyond the individual operator's control. So if the East Coast, West Coast main line goes down, it's not going to, whether you're booked on Lumo, LNER, Avanti, West Coast, you're not going anywhere. So in that sense, there are factors outside the control. I have to say, it's a lovely idea. It's a bit like demand. You know, what we do need to see in this country is wholesale reform of fares. That's the biggest thing. There's something like 1 million different fare combinations, and actually that's one of the arguments. If you're going to do away with ticket offices, you need to make fares simplify them dramatically.
I mean, I don't use the trains very much at all now, but people who do say to me it's so complicated just trying to work out whether you buy. I don't think you can buy a return ticket anymore. You can only buy 2 singles, but you have to be careful when you buy them, and because you could be paying twice as much if you're not. And people don't have that kind of information or that much time on their hands. They have to book a ticket. They book it. If you don't have the wisdom of Solomon, because you don't know everything, then you're going to get screwed, aren't you? Yes,
you are. And I mean, the fact that now there's train line, as one example, will tell you if it's worked out a way to split your fare and make it cheaper, argues, well, surely it should just be cheaper. And actually, one of the arguments on the ticket offices are people saying that in some stations they know the person in the ticket office and they're familiar with them, and they'll go and they'll have a chat with them, and they'll often find a cheaper way to buy a ticket than walking up to the machine and typing in the destination. And I fully believe that, because the machines don't give you the offer of splitting the ticket. No. It's the apps or a clever person in a ticket office who knows what the workarounds are.
Yeah, most people would have no clue.
No. And you have no reason to know. It often depends on when off-peak and peak start and ends and so on. That knowledge is something that, an algorithm can do it, or a human being that knows the railway can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Only, of course, if it's not on a strike day. Which is looming again sometime towards the end of the month, I think.
Yeah, so next week the ASLEF drivers walk out again, which actually is arguably the most disruptive strikes at the moment.
Because then there are no trains at all, are there?
Well, there are, with their overtime bans, there are some trains, but it's severely reduced timetables on most routes. Many commuter routes in and out of big cities that may have 8 trains an hour go down to 1 or 2. Also, lots of last-minute cancellations as well on top of these revised timetables. Yeah. Then there's RMT strikes, although they're less damaging now that it's just train staff. It's not the Network Rail signallers anymore. Right. So the RMT strikes are slightly. The impact of them has been slightly lessened by Network Rail going back. These ASLEF overtime bans, it's a whole week again of it next week, plus RMT strikes as well. It is going to be very difficult for people travelling next week.
And a tube strike as well, right?
There is tube strikes looming again. Those are ASLEF drivers, and that does basically shut down the tube. They're walking out for 2 days later this month.
I remember the last tube strike was actually the traffic was completely and utterly gridlocked.
Yes, although the one thing we don't see as much is when it was previously tube strikes, it always gave the Evening Standard that classic picture of people queuing up at bus stops. And with so much working from home now, certainly looking out, you see a lot of people walking over London Bridge out of our windows here, but it's not as bad as it used to be during the tube strikes. And that, I think, is what we're seeing with the train strikes as well, as the effect of them is that it's not as detrimental as it was
would
before.
Have been. No, true, but I think a lot of people who work in London who are, doing jobs where you have to be there.
Of course.
They are the ones who who suffer at the hands of these Marxists who supposedly are all about the working man. But
undoubtedly. I mean, I've spoken to people who have a half an hour or an hour long tube commute, which is as standard in London, an hour on the tube. Make that 3 hours on the bus at rush hour, and these are people that are getting in for shifts, nurses, doctors, but also everything, just normal street services, bins, waste management, drains, everything. It's jobs that simply cannot be done from home.
Exactly right. Ben, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Ben Clatworthy, travel correspondent from the Times there, of course, with an update on what's going on in the big wide world in case you want to get out of here. It may not be as easy as you think.